Dad's will cut me out, so I dropped a deed that silenced everyone. The words weren't just a sentence, they were a hammer blow, shattering the fragile peace I'd built away from them, away from her, disinherited. The notification from Sterling and Finch had arrived 3 days ago, stark and devoid of warmth, informing me of my father's passing and the impending reading of his last will and testament. It also contained the cruel clinical detail Lucas Anderson, my name, explicitly removed from any inheritance, erased by my own father, the man whose blood ran in my veins, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, to throw a curveball, to believe in honor and legacy, or so I thought. Now, the imposing facade of Sterling and Finch loomed before me, a temple of legal formality where my life was about to be officially, irrevocably rewritten by my father's final act. My stomach twisted, a knot of grief, rage, and a cold, sharp resolve. Inside those polished walls waited Vivian Hartwell, the stepmother who had slithered her way into my father's life and his fortune, along with her 2 entitled vipers, Derek and Tiffany, my father's new family. They called themselves the family who had poisoned his mind against me, piece by insidious piece over the past 15 years, culminating in this ultimate, brutal severing. They thought they had won. They thought I would lick my wounds in the quiet corners of my exile. They were wrong. My hand clenched around the worn leather briefcase. Inside, resting heavy and silent, wasn't just the formal invitation to witness my own dismissal. It was the key, the weapon, a document they knew nothing about. Yet, pushing open the heavy mahogany doors felt like stepping onto a stage under a harsh spotlight. The air inside the conference room was thick with anticipation, hushed and charged like the moment before a storm breaks. Every head snapped towards me. Vivian sat regally at the head of the table, draped in elegant black, a picture of the grieving widow she so expertly pretended to be. Her carefully composed face, usually a mask of simpering sweetness, contorted for a fleeting second, a flicker of surprise and annoyance before snapping back into place. Her children, Derek and Tiffany, sat beside her, their smirks freezing, replaced by expressions ranging from mild shock to open hostility. My unexpected presence was clearly an unwelcome disruption to their planned triumphal procession. "Lucas?" Vivian's voice, a carefully modulated purr, broke the silence. It was edged with a false sympathy that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. We weren't certain you'd grace us with your presence." I didn't bother responding to her thinly veiled jab. My eyes scanned the room, bypassing the few silent observers, distant cousins, a family friend, settling on Mr. Sterling, the lawyer who looked like he'd seen it all, his face a study in professional detachment. He offered a brief, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging my arrival. I walked deliberately to the empty chair placed opposite Vivian, the distance across the table feeling like a chasm carved by years of resentment and betrayal. I placed my briefcase on the table. The soft click of the latch echoed unnervingly in the silence. Vivian, recovering her composure, offered a brittle smile. "Well, it's good you decided to come. Your father would have wanted, well, he would have wanted everyone here." Another lie, wrapped in polite platitudes. My father, in his final years, had been a shell of the man I remembered, his spirit dimmed, perhaps by illness, but undeniably, I believed, by Vivian's suffocating control. She had been his gatekeeper, his confidant, his sole source of information and influence. And now she was set to inherit everything, while I, his only son, was to be left with nothing. The legal term bounced around my skull. Undue influence, the very reason I was here, the very grounds I had been researching relentlessly since that damning letter arrived. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, sensing the volatile mix of emotions in the room. "Since Mr. Lucas Anderson is now present," he announced, his voice calm and formal, cutting through the tension, "we shall proceed with the reading of Mr. Robert Anderson's last will and testament." He picked up the document. This was it. The moment the betrayal would be etched in official record, sealed with legal ink. I watched Vivian. Her expression was serene, a picture of composure. She already knew what it said. She had ensured it. As Sterling began to read, the carefully worded clauses painted a picture of my father's final wishes, or rather, the wishes Vivian had curated. Modest bequests to distant relatives, to charities I'd never heard him express interest in, to longtime employees. Then came the main provisions, the core of the estate, the legacy my father had built through decades of hard work, the sprawling properties, the substantial investments, the thriving businesses. All, without exception, were bequeathed to Vivian Hartwell. His wife, her children, Derek and Tiffany, received significant financial gifts. My name finally appeared near the very end, a single stark sentence delivering the final blow. "To my son, Lucas Anderson, for reasons known to him, I leave nothing. No explanation, no softening words, just a complete, unambiguous cut." A collective ripple of shock went through the room's observers. Vivian's children exchanged smug, victorious glances. Vivian herself allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to grace her lips. They thought they had won. They had successfully orchestrated my professional and familial annihilation. But they had overlooked something. They had underestimated the bond, however strained, between a father and son. They hadn't been privy to the quiet conversations I'd had with my father in the years before Vivian's shadow became absolute, before illness truly took hold. Conversations about the future, about the land, about a promise made, and they hadn't accounted for the contents of my briefcase. "Mr. Sterling finished reading, the finality of his words hanging heavy in the charged silence. He looked at me, his expression now tinged with something akin to pity. "Mr. Anderson," he said, "the terms of the will are as read." Vivian's voice broke in, dripping with feigned compassion. "Lucas, I understand this is upsetting, though your father's decisions were deeply personal." Derek, unable to contain his triumph, added cruelly, "Yeah, guess Dad finally got tired of you." "Huh." "Lucas," Tiffany giggled. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. The years of being sidelined, the constant undermining, the outright lies, it all surged to the surface, a tidal wave of pent-up emotion. They thought they had me cornered, defeated. They thought they had silenced me. I met Vivian's gaze, ignoring her children's taunts. My voice was low, steady, cutting through the air. "Upsetting Vivian. This isn't just upsetting. It's a calculated act of manipulation." Vivian's eyes flashed with anger, the mask of sorrow cracking. "How dare you? Lucas, your father made his wishes clear." "Clear," I repeated, a dangerous calm descending upon me. I reached for my briefcase, the movement slow and deliberate. The room went utterly silent again. All eyes were fixed on me, on the worn leather case. I unlatched it and reached inside. I didn't pull out legal papers or challenges to the will. I pulled out a single, aged document. Its corners were soft with time, the paper bearing the weight of years, a quiet testament to a promise kept. I held it up, letting them see the official seal, the formal layout, before placing it carefully on the table. "My father may have signed that document you just read," I said, my voice resonating with a power I hadn't felt in years. "But it doesn't represent the entirety of his final arrangements. Not by a long shot." Vivian's face drained of color. Her smirk vanished, replaced by genuine shock and a dawning horror. Derek and Tiffany gaped, their earlier arrogance melting into confusion and fear. Mr. Sterling's professional mask shattered. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the document, his usual neutrality replaced by an urgent, professional curiosity. What is that? Lucas. Vivian stammered, her voice thin and reedy. I smoothed the document on the table. It wasn't a challenge to the will, not in the way they expected. It was something simpler, older, and far more potent. It was a deed, a legal instrument, signed and dated years before my father's final illness took hold, years before Vivian's grip on his life became absolute. It was a deed transferring the ownership of a property, not just any property, but the Northridge estate, the original family home, the place where my father and I had built so many memories, the heart of his legacy in my eyes. The deed transferred full, unambiguous ownership directly to me, inter vivos while he was alive, a transaction completed outside the realm of probate, a legal fait accompli that superseded any later will concerning that specific property. I looked directly at Vivian, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. I looked at her children, their expressions a mixture of fury and impotence. I looked around the silent, shocked room. "This," I said, the word hanging in the stunned silence, "is the deed for the Northridge property, signed by my father, witnessed, recorded. It transferred ownership to me 5 years ago." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Vivian's sharp, involuntary gasp. They thought they had cut me out. They thought they had taken everything. But my father, in his own quiet way, had ensured I held a piece of the truth, a piece of the legacy. He had dropped a deed, and it had silenced them all. The game had just changed. The silence, thick with shock, stretched and strained. Vivian, her face a mask of disbelief and rage, finally found her voice. That's impossible," she sputtered, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. "That deed must be a forgery. Robert would never have done this." Derek and Tiffany, equally stunned, echoed her outrage. "A fake!" Derek shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You forged it. Lucas, you're trying to steal what's rightfully ours." Mr. Sterling, however, remained calm. He held the deed, examining it closely. His eyes, sharp and experienced, scanned the signatures, the notary seal, the official recording stamps. He looked up, meeting Vivian's furious gaze with a steady one. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice measured, "this document appears to be authentic. It bears Mr. Anderson's signature, proper witness attestations, and the official seal and stamp from the county recorder's office, dated 5 years ago. Unless you have evidence to the contrary, this deed represents a valid transfer of the Northridge property to Mr. Lucas Anderson." The finality in his tone was a physical blow to Vivian. She sank back in her chair, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom directed at me. Her initial shock was rapidly morphing into cold, calculated fury. This wasn't just about money for her. It was about control, about winning, about erasing any trace of my father's life before her. My own gaze remained fixed on the deed, then on Vivian. The Northridge property wasn't just a piece of land or a house. It was everything. It was the sprawling farmhouse where I grew up, the fields where I learned to work the soil alongside my father, the woods where we hunted, the river where we fished. It was the physical embodiment of my childhood, of my family's history, of the legacy my father had always intended for me before Vivian twisted his world. My estrangement hadn't happened overnight. It was a slow, painful erosion, like a cliff face crumbling under relentless waves. Vivian had appeared in my father's life like a siren, charming and beautiful. Shortly after my mother passed away, I was in my early 20s then, still living at home, working the farm with Dad. At first, she seemed like a breath of fresh air, bringing laughter and a different kind of energy into the house. But gradually, subtly, things began to change. She started making suggestions about the farm, about Dad's business decisions, about the staff. Small things at first, easily dismissed. Then she started inserting herself into our conversations, redirecting Dad's attention whenever we talked about the future, about the plans he and I had made for the farm. She subtly questioned my judgment, my commitment, sowing tiny seeds of doubt in my father's mind. She'd make comments about my lifestyle, my friends, painting me as irresponsible, ungrateful, a drain on my father's resources. Dad, lonely after Mom's death and perhaps vulnerable to Vivian's flattery and attention, didn't seem to see it at first. He was so focused on her, on this new chapter in his life, and I, stubborn and proud, refused to engage in the petty power games. I tried to talk to him, to point out Vivian's manipulations, but he'd dismiss my concerns as jealousy or resentment. "She just wants what's best for me, Lucas," he'd say, a familiar line that became a painful refrain. The tension in the house became unbearable. Every meal was a tightrope walk, every conversation a potential minefield. Vivian's children, Derek and Tiffany, two spoiled adults who saw my father as little more than a walking ATM, exacerbated the situation. They moved in shortly after Vivian and Dad married, adding another layer of chaos and entitlement to the mix. They treated the Northridge property like their personal playground, disrespecting the land, the staff, and the history I held so dear. They saw me as an obstacle, a rival for my father's affection, and more importantly to them, his wealth. The breaking point came during a heated argument about the future of the main barn. It was a structure Dad and I had rebuilt together years ago, a symbol of our shared work and vision. Vivian wanted to tear it down and put in a swimming pool and tennis courts. I argued passionately against it, reminding Dad of the barn's history, its importance to the farm's operation. Vivian twisted my words, making it sound like I was disrespecting his authority. Holding him back, Dad, caught in the middle and seemingly unable to stand up to Vivian, sided with her. It was a deep cut, a betrayal of our shared past and our plans. That night, after the argument, Dad came to my room. He looked tired, defeated. He didn't apologize for siding with Vivian, but he talked about the Northridge property, about the land. He reminded me of the promise he'd made years ago, that the land, the heart of the farm, would always be mine. He said he knew things were difficult, that he saw what was happening, but felt powerless to stop the conflict between me and Vivian. He admitted he was worried, not just about the family tearing itself apart, but about the land, his legacy. That's when he told me about the deed. He'd quietly arranged the transfer years earlier, a safeguard, a way to ensure that the Northridge property, the core of the Anderson legacy, would pass directly to me, bypassing any future disputes or wills. He said he wanted it to be a secret, to avoid further conflict with Vivian and her children while he was alive. He gave me the original deed, told me where it was officially recorded, and made me promise to keep it safe, to use it only if absolutely necessary, if his final wishes were somehow compromised. He looked me in the eye and said, "This is for you, son. Always remember what this land means. Protect it." Leaving home was the hardest thing I ever did, but staying was destroying me. The constant conflict, the feeling of being an outsider in my own home, the pain of watching my father slip away under Vivian's influence, it was too much. I moved across the country, built my own life, but the Northridge property, that deed, remained a quiet anchor, a reminder of a promise and a legacy I was sworn to protect. I kept in touch with Dad sporadically, but Vivian made it difficult, intercepting calls, managing his visitors. Our relationship became a series of brief, stilted phone calls, punctuated by long silences and unspoken resentments. Then came the letter, the news of his death, the shock, the grief, quickly followed by the cold, hard truth of the will, disinherited. The betrayal was absolute. It confirmed every fear I'd ever had about Vivian, about the extent of her manipulation. She hadn't just pushed me out of his life, she had tried to erase me from his legacy entirely. Sitting here now, watching Vivian's face contort with fury and her children's entitlement curdle into panic, I knew Dad's instincts had been right. His final, formal will was a product of undue influence, a perversion of his true intentions orchestrated by Vivian. But the deed was a testament to a different time, a different promise, a quiet act of a father ensuring his son would inherit what was rightfully his. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken accusations and rising hostility. Vivian regained a semblance of control, her eyes now cold and calculating. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Authenticity can be questioned. We will certainly be contesting the validity of this document." Derek, emboldened by his mother's renewed resolve, sneered. "Yeah. Who knows what kind of pressure Lucas put Dad under, or maybe he just forged the whole thing himself." My hand tightened into a fist under the table. They were already spinning their web of lies, their narrative of my supposed deceit, but they underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect my father's true legacy, to honor that quiet promise. The battle had moved beyond the reading of a will. It had become a fight for truth, for justice, for the soul of the Anderson family. Vivian's threat to contest the deed hung in the air like a foul odor, a promise of a protracted, ugly fight. Leaving the conference room at Sterling and Finch felt less like walking out and more like being ejected from a pressure cooker just before it exploded. The polite farewells exchanged were paper-thin veils over simmering animosity. Vivian shot me one last look of pure malice, a look that promised retribution. Derek and Tiffany glared, their faces contorted with thwarted greed. Mr. Sterling, ever the professional, simply handed me a business card and advised me to retain legal counsel familiar with complex estate litigation. The battle lines had been drawn, clearly and irrevocably. The relief I'd felt in dropping the deed, that brief, potent moment of silencing them, evaporated quickly, replaced by a crushing weight of anxiety and exhaustion. I walked out into the late afternoon sun, the city noise feeling distant and unreal after the suffocating quiet of the law firm. My hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the confrontation. I had thrown my first punch, and it had landed, but Vivian was already winding up for a counterstrike, and I knew she wouldn't pull any. True to her word, the escalation began almost immediately. Within 48 hours, I received a letter from Vivian's lawyers, a different, flashier firm than Sterling and Finch, one known for aggressive litigation. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It formally challenged the validity of the Northridge deed, alleging undue influence on my father by me at the time of the transfer, citing my known history of financial instability and strained relationship with my father as evidence. They demanded full disclosure of all communications between my father and me regarding the property transfer and threatened a lawsuit for fraud and conspiracy if I did not immediately relinquish my claim. Undue influence by me. The sheer audacity of the accusation stole my breath for a moment. They were twisting the knife, using the very tactics Vivian had likely employed against my father and turning them on me. They were painting me as the villain, the manipulative son taking advantage of his frail father, while presenting Vivian as the grieving widow protecting her husband's true final wishes. It was a sickening distortion of reality, a calculated attempt to discredit me in the eyes of the court and public opinion, should the case go to trial. The letter didn't just increase the stakes. It introduced a new, more insidious layer to the conflict. It attacked my character, my motives, and my history with my father. It forced me to confront not only the legal challenge of the deed, but also the emotional pain of having my relationship with Dad slandered and misrepresented. The strained relationship they cited wasn't just a legal term, it was 15 years of heartache, of trying and failing to break through Vivian's wall, of watching my father drift further away. Now, that pain was being weaponized against me. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Anya Sharma, recommended by a contact I trusted. As I sat in her office, recounting the history, showing her the deed and Vivian's letter, the story sounded almost unbelievable when laid out clinically. A stepmother, undue influence, a secret deed, a disinheritance, and now accusations of fraud. Anya listened patiently, her expression grave but focused. "This is going to be a messy fight. Lucas," she said, leaning back in her chair, "Vivian's firm is aggressive. They'll dig into everything. Your father's health records around the time the deed was signed, your financial history, any evidence they can find to suggest you coerced your father or that he wasn't of sound mind. And they will absolutely try to paint you as estranged and opportunistic." "But Dad was of sound mind when he signed that deed," I insisted, the memory of that conversation with him vivid. It was years before he really started to decline. "We'll need proof," Anya said. "Witnesses, medical records, anything to establish his capacity and your history with him. The deed is strong evidence, but they will argue it was obtained improperly." The emotional discomfort deepened. I knew my father had been in a difficult position, likely caught between his love for me and his relationship with Vivian. The secret deed was his flawed, desperate attempt to protect me and the legacy he cherished. Now, defending the deed meant potentially exposing the extent of Vivian's influence over him, perhaps even questioning his judgment in his final years, which felt like another form of betrayal, even if unintentional. It felt like I was being forced to put my father on trial to prove my own legitimacy. The complications didn't stop with the legal threats. Vivian used her social connections, her influence within the community, to spread her version of events. Whispers started circulating about my sudden reappearance, my supposed lack of care for my father in his final days, my alleged attempt to steal from the estate. Old family friends, people who had known me since I was a child, started looking at me with suspicion or pity. My phone remained silent. Calls I made went unanswered. Vivian wasn't just fighting me in court. She was trying to isolate me, to turn the community against me. This was a new kind of pain, not just legal or financial, but social and emotional ostracism. Derek and Tiffany, clearly taking cues from their mother, became thorns in my side. They started appearing at the Northridge property, which, despite the deed, was technically still part of the larger estate being managed by Sterling and Finch during the probate process. They would walk the grounds, take pictures, sometimes even attempt to access the main house, claiming they were inspecting their future inheritance. They left passive-aggressive messages with the caretakers, questioning my right to even visit the property. It was a constant, petty harassment, designed to provoke and remind me that they weren't giving up. Seeing them on that land, the land my father had given me, the land they felt entitled to, filled me with a cold fury and a deep sense of violation. One afternoon, I drove out to the Northridge property. I needed to be there, to feel the ground beneath my feet, to connect with the place that represented everything I was fighting for. As I walked towards the old barn, the one Vivian had wanted to tear down, I saw Derek and Tiffany by the riverbank, laughing and pointing. They saw me and their laughter died. Derek smirked and raised his phone, clearly taking pictures of me on the property. "Get off the land, Lucas," Tiffany shouted, her voice shrill. "You don't belong here anymore." "This land belongs to me," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor of anger. I held up the rolled-up copy of the deed I now carried with me everywhere. My father made sure of that. Derek walked towards me, his hands stuffed in his pockets, a confident swagger in his step. That fake piece of paper won't hold up in court. Lucas, everyone knows you were cut out. Dad told us himself how disappointed he was in you." Another lie, another calculated jab. The pain of his words was sharp, a reminder of the narrative they were constructing. Were there moments of disappointment? Of course, every father and son have them. But did my father truly feel that way about me? Especially in the end? Or was that another story, crafted by Vivian and her children? "He gave me this property," I said, my voice low. "He gave it to me to protect his legacy. Something you two wouldn't understand." Tiffany scoffed. "Legacy. Please. Dad knew we were the future. He left everything to Mom. Everything." The certainty in her voice, the complete lack of understanding of what the Northridge property truly represented, was chilling. They saw it only as an asset, a number on a balance sheet. I saw it as home, history, a promise. "We'll see about that," I said, turning away from them. I couldn't stand to be near their corrosive entitlement for another second. As I walked towards the barn, towards the tangible link to my father that they couldn't touch, I felt the weight of the fight press down on me. It wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a war on multiple fronts, legal, social, and deeply personal. They were using every weapon they had, twisting truths, spreading lies, harassing me at every turn. The emotional cost was mounting. I was battling not just for property, but for my father's memory, for my own place in his history, for the truth of what he truly intended. The initial shock of the will had evolved into a grinding, relentless struggle that threatened to consume me. The pressure from Vivian and her legal sharks felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me, stealing my sleep, clouding my thoughts. Anya was doing her best, diligently collecting evidence, deposing witnesses, building our defense against their spurious claims. But the legal process was slow, expensive, and soul-crushing. And every legal filing from Vivian's side was a fresh wound, filled with twisted truths and outright lies designed to paint me as a villain. Their narrative was simple: Lucas Anderson, the estranged, financially struggling son, resurfaces only after his wealthy father's death to fraudulently claim a piece of the estate using a forged deed. Vivian Hartwell, the loving, devoted wife, is merely protecting her deceased husband's real final wishes against this greedy interloper. The social isolation was a constant, low-grade ache. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Friends I'd known my entire life awkwardly avoided my gaze in the grocery store. The whispers followed me, carried on the wind through this small, close-knit community where my family had lived for generations. Vivian was a master manipulator, and she was using her charm and influence to poison the well, turning people against me before I even had a chance to speak my truth. It was a lonely, bitter feeling to be treated like a pariah in the place that was supposed to be home. But the most painful attacks were the personal ones, the ones aimed at the fragile remnants of my relationship with my father. Their lawyers dug into every argument we'd ever had, every period of silence, every moment of distance, presenting it as proof of my supposed abandonment and his disappointment. They requested access to his personal journals, his emails, anything that might contain a hint of criticism towards me. It felt like they were desecrating his memory to serve their own greed, twisting his words and reducing our complex, flawed, but ultimately loving relationship to a cold, transactional failure. It was an unbearable violation. The harassment at Northridge continued, a constant reminder of what was at stake and who I was fighting against. Derek and Tiffany seemed to take perverse pleasure in being there, treating the property with a casual disrespect that made my blood boil. They'd leave trash by the riverbank, drive their ATVs across the fields, and sometimes I'd find evidence they'd been trying to get into the house, pry marks on windows, footprints on the porch. The caretakers, loyal to my father but wary of getting involved in the family feud, were caught in the middle, stressed and uncomfortable. Protecting the property felt increasingly difficult. Not just legally, but physically. One evening, after a particularly brutal day dealing with depositions and invasive questions about my financial history, I drove out to Northridge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The old farmhouse stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, looking both welcoming and terribly lonely. I parked the car and just stood there for a long time, the quiet broken only by the distant murmur of the river and the rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks. The weight of everything crashed down on me. The legal bills piling up, the isolation, the constant barrage of lies and accusations. Was it worth it? Was this relentless, painful fight for a piece of land worth the emotional toll it was taking? Doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep in. Maybe I should just let it go. Maybe I should just walk away, cut my losses, and try to build a life free from this toxic legacy. The thought was tempting, a siren song of peace and escape, but it felt like a betrayal, not just of my father, but of myself, of the man I was supposed to be. As the light faded, I walked towards the barn. My father and I had spent countless hours in that barn, repairing equipment, mending fences, planning the next season's crops. The air inside still smelled faintly of hay and oil and my father's pipe tobacco. I ran my hand along the rough-hewn beams, remembering him, his strong hands, the lines etched around his eyes from years of sun and worry and quiet determination. I sat down on an old workbench, the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the cracks in the walls. And then I broke. The dam of carefully controlled emotion gave way. Grief for my father, raw and sharp, the grief I hadn't allowed myself to fully process amidst the chaos, washed over me. It mingled with the pain of his perceived betrayal in the will, the anger at Vivian, the frustration of being misunderstood and maligned. Tears, hot and unexpected, streamed down my face. I buried my face in my hands, the sobs racking my body. It was a release, yes, but it also felt like a surrender, a complete emotional collapse under the relentless pressure. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the darkness and the depth of my despair. But gradually, as the sobs subsided and the air grew colder, a different feeling began to emerge. It wasn't resignation. It was a flicker, a spark of something stubborn and resilient. I remembered that last real conversation with my father, the night after the argument about the barn. I remembered the look in his eyes, the weariness, yes, but also the fierce protectiveness when he talked about the land, about the legacy. He knew what Vivian was capable of. He knew she would try to take everything. The secret deed wasn't a sign of his lack of faith in me. It was an act of faith in me. It was his way of saying, "I see you, son. I know you love this land. Protect it when I no longer can." He wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, his blind spots, especially where Vivian was concerned. He had hurt me deeply by allowing the estrangement to fester, by not fighting harder for our relationship in the face of her manipulation. But in that moment, sitting in the quiet, hallowed space of the barn, I saw past the pain and the conflict to the core of his intention. He had given me the Northridge property not just as an asset, but as a trust, a responsibility. The Northridge wasn't just land and buildings. It was a symbol of something enduring, something authentic in a world that had suddenly become full of artifice and lies. It was a connection to my history, to my roots, to the man my father was before Vivian. And it was worth fighting for, not just for the property itself, but for the truth of my father's intentions, for the honor of his memory, for my own integrity. The despair began to recede, replaced by a quiet, burning resolve. They wanted to bury me under legal paperwork and social scorn. They wanted to paint me as a greedy opportunist. Fine, let them try. But I would not be broken. I would not back down. My father had given me the means to fight, a truth etched in that deed. It was time to stop reacting to their attacks and start fighting on my own terms. Getting up from the workbench, my legs stiff but my mind clear, I walked to the barn door and looked out at the dark fields. The stars were beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. The air was cold and clean. The emotional collapse in the barn hadn't been a surrender. It had been a cleansing fire. It had burned away the doubt and the despair, leaving behind a hard, bright core of determination. I pulled out my phone and called Anya Sharma. Despite the late hour, she answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with concern. "Lucas, is everything all right?" "It is now," I said, my voice steady. "Anya, I want to go on the offensive. I want to file a counterclaim. I want to formally accuse Vivian Hartwell of undue influence over my father in the creation of his final will, and I want to do it publicly. It's time we stopped defending and started fighting." The turning point had arrived. My call to Anya Sharma, late as it was, marked a turning point. The emotional collapse in the barn had stripped away the fear and the doubt, leaving a hard core of resolve. I was done reacting. It was time to attack. Anya, bless her steady nerves, understood immediately. We scheduled an emergency meeting the next morning, and I brought with me not just the deed, but boxes filled with everything I could find, old photographs, letters from my father written before Vivian, notes I'd taken over the years detailing Vivian's behavior and my father's decline, even printouts of my research into undue influence and probate law. The legal strategy was clear, though daunting. While Vivian's lawyers were challenging the deed, claiming I had unduly influenced my father, our primary attack would be to challenge the will itself, arguing that Vivian had exerted undue influence over him. Proving undue influence is notoriously difficult. The burden of proof lies with the person making the claim, me. We had to demonstrate several key elements that my father was vulnerable to influence due to age, health, and emotional state, that Vivian had the opportunity and motive to influence him, that she used tactics to do so, and that the resulting will was an unnatural or unexpected disposition of his assets, benefiting her significantly while disinheriting his only son. Our evidence for my father's vulnerability included medical records Anya obtained showing a decline in health and some cognitive impairment in his final years, witness testimonies from former staff members and a few brave family friends who had seen Vivian's controlling behavior and Dad's increasing isolation, and my own detailed accounts of his frailty and dependence. Vivian's opportunity and motive were self-evident. She lived with him, managed his life, and stood to inherit everything under the contested will. The tactics she used were harder to prove definitively, but the consistent narrative of her isolating him from me, intercepting communications, and subtly undermining my relationship with him over 15 years painted a compelling picture. The unnatural disposition was the will itself, a stark, unexplained disinheritance of a direct heir in favor of a relatively new spouse and her children. Conversely, our defense against their claim that I had unduly influenced Dad regarding the deed was strong. The deed was signed years earlier, when my father's health and mental capacity were demonstrably better. We had the date on the recorded deed and potentially witnesses from that time. A deed, representing a completed transfer of property during the grantor's lifetime, is generally considered a stronger legal instrument for property transfer than a will, which only takes effect after death and goes through probate. While a deed can still be challenged for undue influence, the timing of the Northridge deed significantly weakened their argument. Anya drafted the counterclaim, a document laying bare Vivian's alleged manipulation and challenging the validity of the will. Filing it felt like unleashing a pent-up force. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing, a chance for both sides to present their initial arguments and for a judge to get a sense of the case's direction. This would be the first time I would formally, publicly accuse Vivian of what I knew she had done. The courtroom was less formal than the conference room, but the stakes felt infinitely higher. Vivian sat with her lawyers, flanked by Derek and Tiffany, their faces a mix of anger and apprehension. Their expensive suits and poised demeanor were a stark contrast to my simpler clothes, but I felt a strength radiating from the truth of my position. A strength they lacked. Anya presented our case first. She spoke calmly, clearly, outlining the elements of undue influence and presenting the initial evidence we had gathered. She detailed Vivian's increasing control over my father's life, his declining health in his final years, the abrupt and unexplained change in his estate plan from previous intentions, which we would prove with earlier draft wills if needed, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the signing of the final will. She spoke about the Northridge property, not just as an asset, but as the heart of my father's legacy, and introduced the legally executed deed as proof of his earlier true intentions regarding that land. Vivian's lead lawyer, a man with a condescending air, then presented their counter-arguments. He dismissed our claims as the desperate actions of a disinherited son. He painted a picture of me as having abandoned my father, only reappearing to claim a fortune I hadn't earned. He reiterated their claim that I had manipulated my father into signing the deed for Northridge years ago, taking advantage of his generosity. He highlighted the strained relationship as proof of my father's disappointment in me, justifying my exclusion from the will. He spoke with practiced ease, weaving a narrative of my supposed greed and deceit. It was a refined version of the whispers Vivian had spread through the community, amplified and legitimized within the walls of the courtroom. The emotional discomfort was intense, hearing my life and my relationship with my father distorted and used against me. I had to clench my fists to stop them from trembling, focusing on Anya's calm presence beside me and the quiet strength of the deed resting in my briefcase. Then it was my turn to speak. Anya had advised me to be direct, honest, and focused on the facts, but also to convey the emotional truth of the situation. I stood up, facing the judge, but my gaze swept over Vivian and her children. Their narrative, I began, my voice steady, is a carefully constructed fiction. They talk about a strained relationship as if it was one-sided. My fault. They don't talk about 15 years of being systematically pushed out of my father's life by Mrs. Hartwell. I spoke about my mother's death, Vivian's arrival, the subtle ways she began to control access to my father and influence his decisions. I spoke about the growing tension, the arguments, the pain of watching my father change. I acknowledged the difficulties in our relationship, but stated unequivocally that it was not one of abandonment, but of forced distance created by Vivian. Then I turned to the will. They claim my father willingly disinherited me, I said, my voice rising slightly, but this will does not reflect the man I knew, the values he held, or the promises he made. It reflects the wishes of someone who had gained almost total control over his life in his most vulnerable years. I looked directly at Vivian. Mrs. Hartwell isolated him. She managed his finances. She controlled who saw him and what information reached him. The will she benefited so greatly from is the direct result of that control. I then addressed their claims about the deed. They allege I unduly influenced my father to obtain the deed for Northridge, I said, picking up my briefcase and placing the deed on the table before me. This deed was signed and recorded 5 years ago. At that time, my father was still active, still sharp, still very much his own man. He transferred this property to me as an act of foresight, to protect the heart of his legacy from what he feared would happen. My voice softened slightly as I looked at the deed. He gave me this property, the home I grew up in, the land we worked together. because he knew I would cherish it, protect it, and honor its history in a way that others— I glanced pointedly at Derek and Tiffany— never could or would. The courtroom was silent. Vivian's face was rigid with fury, her knuckles white where she gripped the table. Derek and Tiffany looked less confident now, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. The contrast between the complex emotional truth I was laying bare and the simplistic, greedy narrative they had constructed was stark. "A will can be challenged based on undue influence," I stated, looking at the judge. "And we believe this one is a clear case of it. But a deed, properly executed and recorded years before my father's significant decline, stands as powerful evidence of his true, independent intentions regarding the Northridge property." "He dropped this deed," I said, my voice firm, "because he knew, even then, that he might be cut out of his own story, manipulated by those he trusted. He gave me the means to ensure his true legacy would survive." The hearing concluded shortly after. The judge didn't issue a ruling, but the atmosphere had shifted. Vivian's side was clearly rattled. Their attempt to frame me had been countered by a direct attack on their own actions, supported by a legal document that bypassed the contested will entirely regarding the Northridge property. The courtroom confrontation was just the beginning of the climax. But the initial blow had landed. Vivian's silence from the first will reading was broken, replaced by a desperate need to defend herself. But my carefully timed revelation of the deed, now backed by a formal legal challenge, had shifted the power dynamics entirely. The fight for my father's legacy, and the truth, was now fully engaged. The legal battle escalated rapidly after the preliminary hearing. Filings and counterfilings flew between Anya's office and Vivian's high-powered legal team. Depositions were scheduled, grueling. Hours-long sessions where both sides interrogated key witnesses under oath. I sat through my own, facing invasive questions about my finances, my relationship with my father, my character. I watched, equally intently, as Vivian, Derek, and Tiffany were deposed. Vivian was polished and evasive during her deposition, carefully choosing her words, maintaining a facade of sorrow and wronged innocence. But under Anya's persistent questioning, cracks began to show. Anya pressed her on the timeline of my father's health decline, her role in managing his affairs, the specific instructions she gave to staff regarding his visitors, particularly me, Chauvel. She highlighted inconsistencies between Vivian's statements and those of former employees Anya had interviewed, loyal people who had seen the gradual shift in the household dynamic and my father's increasing isolation. Vivian grew visibly flustered, her answers becoming shorter, sharper. Derek and Tiffany were less adept at hiding their true natures. Their depositions revealed a staggering sense of entitlement and a surprising ignorance about the details of my father's businesses and estate before Vivian entered the picture. They contradicted each other on key dates and events, and their primary focus seemed to be on the monetary value of the estate, with little understanding or appreciation for the history or the work that built it. They spoke about the Northridge property as a potential site for new development, for luxury homes or a golf course, a stark contrast to its history as a working farm and family home. This contrast, Anya noted, would be powerful evidence in court, supporting the idea that my father's final will, which aligned with their purely financial view, was unnatural compared to his lifetime intentions. Evidenced by the deed, our key witness proved invaluable Mrs. Thogable, my father's longtime personal secretary, who had retired a year before he passed away, citing difficulties working with Vivian. She was a woman of quiet integrity, fiercely loyal to my father's memory. In her deposition, she testified to my father's increasing frailty in his final years and, crucially, confirmed that Vivian had gradually taken over managing his correspondence, screening his calls, and often being present during his meetings, even with his lawyers. Most significantly, She testified that she had helped my father gather the necessary documents for the Northridge deed transfer 5 years earlier, confirming he was of sound mind and acted independently at that time. She even produced copies of correspondence and notes she had kept, meticulously detailing the process and my father's clear intention to gift the property to me directly. This was a direct hit against Vivian's claim that I had unduly influenced him regarding the deed. The mounting evidence, particularly Mrs. Gable's testimony and the solid legal standing of the recorded deed, put significant pressure on Vivian's side. They realized challenging the deed was becoming a losing battle. Instead, they doubled down on attacking the will, filing motions to suppress Mrs. B. Gable's testimony and attempting to paint her as a disgruntled former employee biased against Vivian. But their core argument, that the will represented my father's clear, uninfluenced final wishes, was crumbling under the weight of the evidence pointing to his vulnerability and Vivian's pervasive control. The climax arrived not in a dramatic courtroom trial, but in a high-stakes mediation session ordered by the judge. Mediation is a process where both sides meet with a neutral third party to try and reach a settlement outside of court. It was held in a sterile conference room, similar to the one where the will was first read, but the atmosphere was thick with tension, not just anticipation. Vivian was there, looking impeccably dressed, but her eyes held a flicker of fear I hadn't seen before. Derek and Tiffany were beside her, their usual cockiness replaced by nervous fidgeting. Facing them were Anya and I, armed with the mounting evidence. The mediator, a calm, experienced attorney, laid out the process. Vivian's lawyers opened, reiterating their position, though their tone lacked the aggressive certainty of their earlier filings. They focused on the contested will, downplaying Vivian's role in my father's life and emphasizing my alleged absence and estrangement. They offered a settlement proposal, a small financial sum for me in exchange for dropping my claims and acknowledging the will's validity and Vivian's ownership of all assets, including Northridge. It was insulting, a clear indication they still underestimated my resolve and the strength of my position regarding the deed. Anya countered, calmly and clinically laying out the evidence we had gathered for the undue influence claim against Vivian regarding the will. She referenced Mrs. Gable's testimony, the medical records, the inconsistencies in Vivian's own deposition. She then presented the Northridge deed, undeniable proof of my father's intentions regarding that specific property years before. She explained the legal principle of valid deed transferring property inter vivos takes precedence over a later will regarding that property. The Northridge property, Anya stated firmly, was legally mine, irrespective of what the contested will said. She made it clear that we would not settle for anything less than full acknowledgement of the deed's validity and a significant portion of the remaining estate, arguing that the will, if proven to be the product of undue influence, could be overturned entirely. The atmosphere in the room grew frigid. Vivian's lawyers exchanged tense whispers with her. Vivian's face was a mask of fury, directed silently at Anya, then at me. She hadn't expected us to be so prepared, so relentless. She thought her money and her lawyers could simply steamroll me. Then, Anya played her final decisive card in the mediation. She informed Vivian's legal team that, based on the evidence of undue influence and potential fraud surrounding the will, we were also preparing to file a formal complaint with the State Bar Association against the attorney who had drafted the contested will. If there was any evidence of their complicity or failure to properly assess my father's capacity and potential for undue influence. This wasn't a direct threat to Vivian, but it introduced a serious new complication that could drag other parties into the mess and potentially expose even more about how the will was created. It was a subtle but powerful move, widening the scope of potential fallout. Vivian's composure finally shattered. "You can't!" she shrieked, rising halfway from her chair. "You absolute! How dare you!" Her lawyers immediately tried to calm her, but the mask was off. The carefully constructed image of the grieving widow was gone, replaced by the furious, cornered woman who saw her control, her ill-gotten gains, slipping away. Derek and Tiffany looked horrified, not just by her outburst, but by the dawning realization that their mother's scheming might backfire completely, leaving them with far less than they'd anticipated. The mediator intervened, calling for a short recess to allow the parties to confer privately. As Vivian was ushered into a separate room by her frantic lawyers, she shot me one last look, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But beneath the hatred, there was fear. The deed I had dropped that day at the will reading, combined with the relentless legal pursuit and the evidence we had unearthed, had not only silenced her initial claims, but had now backed her into a corner. During the recess, Anya explained the significance of the moment. "She knows we have her," Anya said quietly. "The deed is solid, and our undue influence case is strong. The threat of involving the state bar is a serious one for the lawyer who drafted the will, and that lawyer will likely put pressure on Vivian to settle rather than have their own practice investigated. She realizes she can't bluff her way out of this." When mediation resumed, the atmosphere was different. Vivian was subdued, her face pale and strained. Her lawyers did the talking. The tone was conciliatory. They no longer challenged the validity of the Northridge deed. They acknowledged it was legally transferred to me inter vivos. Their focus shifted entirely to negotiating a settlement for the rest of the estate, clearly hoping to minimize their losses and avoid a public trial that would expose the full extent of Vivian's actions. The power had shifted completely. The deed, that single piece of paper I had held onto for years, hadn't just given me a foothold. It had become the lever that pried open the truth and dismantled Vivian's carefully constructed lies. The confrontation wasn't a shouting match. It was a calculated legal maneuver, backed by irrefutable evidence that forced Vivian to face the consequences of her greed and manipulation. The silence that followed Anya's final points in mediation was more profound than the silence at the will reading. It was the silence of a plan unraveling, of a victory stolen, of a manipulator finally cornered by the truth. Vivian Hartwell was silenced. Not by my words, but by the weight of the evidence, the strength of the law, and the undeniable truth embodied in the deed I had dropped. The mediation stretched on for hours, a tense, exhausting negotiation behind closed doors. With the validity of the Northridge deed no longer in dispute, the focus shifted entirely to the remaining assets in the estate and how they would be divided. Vivian, now stripped of her primary weapon and facing the very real possibility of a public trial where her actions would be scrutinized and her reputation destroyed, was forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. Her initial demands were dramatically reduced, and her lawyers fought to salvage what they could while minimizing the damage. Anya was relentless but strategic. She wasn't just fighting for money, she was fighting for a just outcome, one that reflected my father's true intentions and punished Vivian for her deceit. We had strong leverage with the undue influence claim on the will. While a judge might not overturn the entire will, the threat was significant enough to force Vivian into concessions. The final settlement was a complex agreement. Vivian retained a portion of the liquid assets and some smaller properties, but it was significantly less than she would have inherited under the contested will. Derek and Tiffany received only minor bequests, a fraction of what their mother had promised them, and most importantly, the settlement explicitly reaffirmed my undisputed ownership of the Northridge property, stating that the contested will had no bearing on its title. Additionally, there was a confidentiality clause preventing either side from publicly discussing the details of the settlement or the allegations of undue influence, a concession Vivian desperately wanted to protect her tarnished reputation. For me, the confidentiality was less important than securing the Northridge and achieving a measure of justice, but it served its purpose in getting Vivian to agree. Signing the settlement papers in Anya's office a few days later felt strangely anticlimactic after the emotional roller coaster of the past few months. There was no triumphant fanfare. Just the quiet scratch of pens on paper, legally binding the terms that had been so fiercely contested. I had won, in the legal sense, but the victory was tinged with sadness and the lingering pain of the fight. The aftermath was a period of quiet rebuilding. The Northridge property was officially, unequivocally mine. I drove out there shortly after the settlement was finalized, walking through the fields, entering the old farmhouse, feeling the weight of ownership and responsibility settle upon my shoulders. It wasn't just a victory, it was a homecoming. The caretakers, visibly relieved that the conflict was over, greeted me warmly. Life on the farm, disrupted by the legal battle and the unsettling presence of Vivian's children, could finally begin to return to normal, or a new version of it. Vivian, Derek, and Tiffany disappeared from the local scene shortly after the settlement. The whispers about me gradually died down, replaced by a grudging respect from some, awkward apologies from others. The community, which had been so quick to judge based on Vivian's narrative, slowly began to see the truth, or at least the undeniable legal outcome. Some relationships were too damaged to repair, but others, built on deeper history and respect for my father, slowly began to mend. The Northridge property became my focus. I started working the land again, feeling the familiar rhythm of the seasons, the connection to the soil that was in my blood. I made plans to restore the old barn, just as my father and I had intended years ago. I walked the riverbank, not with a heavy heart, but with a sense of continuity, of carrying on the legacy he had entrusted to me. The property wasn't just a reminder of the painful fight. It was a living testament to my father, to his foresight, and to the enduring strength of the bond we shared, flawed as it was. I thought a lot about my father during this time. The anger I'd felt over the will had subsided, replaced by a deeper understanding. He hadn't disinherited me out of malice or disappointment. He had likely been manipulated and pressured during a time of vulnerability. The secret deed for Northridge wasn't a sign of his weakness, but of his quiet strength and his unwavering love, a desperate measure taken to ensure his son would inherit what truly mattered. He couldn't fight Vivian openly in his final years, but he had found a way, a quiet act of defiance, to protect his legacy and provide for me. The legal battle had been brutal, exposing the worst of human greed and manipulation. It had forced me to confront painful truths about my family, about my father's final years, and about the depths of Vivian's deceit. But it had also reaffirmed the importance of fighting for what is right, of honoring promises, and of the power of truth even when buried under layers of lies. Dropping that deed at the will reading hadn't just silenced Vivian in that moment. It had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately dismantled her plan and secured my rightful inheritance. It had been the catalyst, the key that unlocked the truth and allowed justice, in its imperfect legal form, to prevail. The silence that followed the settlement wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was the quiet satisfaction of a battle won, a legacy protected, and a promise kept. My father's will had cut me out, but the deed he had secretly given me had ultimately ensured that his true intentions, his real legacy, would endure. The fight was over. It was time to heal, to build, and to honor the man who, in his own way, had ensured I would always have a home.